I'm Janet Silver, and while MPs have spent the last 2 weeks off the Hill, the government has announced deals with provinces on its 10-year, $196 billion healthcare funding proposal. And governments across the country are banning TikTok from its devices, while calls for an inquiry into China's alleged interference in the 2021 election continue. There's lots on the agenda when MPs return to Parliament Hill on Monday. And joining me now to break it all down are two experienced political operatives and my colleagues here at Syntax Strategic, John Dugal and Jake Enright. And Jake, I'm going to start with you. The federal government is approaching healthcare deals with provinces much the same way that it did with childcare agreements. In other words, negotiating one-on-one, allowing for slightly different arrangements with each province. Good strategy?
Yeah, it's smart. It not only works from a policy perspective, and it's the best approach that is healthy for our federation, but it also takes away the main talking point of conservatives, which is that Justin Trudeau engages in a one-size-fits-all, Ottawa knows best approach to confederation. So it works on both fronts. Whether or not it actually leads to better outcomes for Canadians in terms of the healthcare services that they receive, that remains to be seen, and I'm a skeptic.
John, I just want to get your thoughts on that, because these transfers are also divided up by population. Is this the arrangement that provinces wanted?
I would say no. They would have much preferred a just blanket increase to the Canada Health transfer across the board. But just to go back maybe to your first question, that is also part of the brilliance of the actual federal strategy here, right? Is because when you look back over the past couple of years, for example, the federal government was rolling out 80% and then some of total COVID funding and the entire response to the pandemic across the country. But what ended up happening in that period? The provinces were rolling the funding into general revenues, and they were posting significant surpluses. For example, in my native PEI, the premier last year posted a $50 million surplus. And this year, he's saying that the federal offer to increase the Canada Health transfer is actually $50 million too short. So is the premier saying he couldn't have spent the $50 million that he had received and created a surplus through significantly increased federal transfers over the last couple of years? Could he have not put that towards the healthcare system before? You know, that's obviously up for debate. And what we're going to see here too, I think over the next couple of weeks, couple of months, is that a couple of provinces are actually going very quickly into an election. For example, in PEI, we expect a writ to be dropped this coming week, and Islanders will likely be heading to the polls in and around the Easter long weekend at the start of April. In 2 months' time, at the very latest, we'll be seeing another provincial election in Alberta, who actually they themselves just tabled their budget with increased health spending across the board. So you see the health dynamics, or kind of those dynamics playing out from the Canada Health transfer into the provincial budget cycle now, and also into that provincial election cycle that will inevitably come forward in a couple jurisdictions this year.
Well, speaking of provinces, Jake, Ontario Premier Doug Ford was asked about his plan this week about expanding privatized care. And he said that as long as he was premier, quote, you can pay with your OHIP card, not your credit card. Yet lots of people are really nervous that the premier is creating opportunities for increased private health care. And the NDP are saying in that province are saying more private care will increase charges overall. And I'm just wondering, with these health transfers, the deals that's being done with the feds, whether or not provinces may be opening up areas that may create a bag of worms, if you will, for them politically on the domestic front with this kind of arrangement with private healthcare, for example.
Yeah, I don't see that being an outcome at the end of the day, because Justin Trudeau has demonstrated, and the federal Liberals have demonstrated, a willingness to withhold transfer payments if the provinces aren't enacting healthcare services to their liking. Now, whether that liking is right or wrong is the debate, but they haven't hesitated to use that power before, and I don't think they would hesitate again, especially if it was Premier Doug Ford in Ontario. The Ontario NDP are playing from a hymn book that is as old as time. Canadians are grossly misinformed about what their healthcare system is. They're grossly misinformed about the level of privatization that already exists within it. And they're grossly misinformed about what other countries have done, whom Canada has emulated our system off of, and the blend of private and public care that exists in Norwegian countries. So they're playing off people's fears. They're playing off a myth. it's full marks for a great political attack, but it actually doesn't hold a lot of truth or merit.
A couple of great points, but it's not just the NDP at the provincial level here. It's also the NDP at the federal level. They're accusing Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberal government, especially within the context of these renegotiated Canada Health transfer agreements, that they are actually opening the door to increased privatization as well, just for the sake of having been willing to, let's say, quote unquote, go along with Ontario in the past couple of weeks here as the announcements roll on. And for his part, the Prime Minister and, in fact, the Health Minister himself, they have looked at what's gone on in Ontario and actually called it, quote unquote, innovation within the health space, which is good, right? Like, Canadians deserve access to healthcare services. And I think the Prime Minister and the Health Minister federally on the Liberal side get that. They know that at the end of the day, what really will come down when push comes to shove is that Canadians are looking for access to healthcare services. They're looking for reduced wait times. They're looking for increased access to primary care. They're looking to increase access through mental health resources. They're looking for increased access at the emergency rooms. And the NDP don't seem to be getting that necessarily. And they're getting bogged down in maybe a quagmire here, let's say, that doesn't necessarily need to exist. Because under the Canada Health Act, there are measures. For example, the health minister just tabled his report a couple days ago. Well, I guess a couple days ago in the sitting cycle, but he just tabled his report for 2020-2021 year under the Canada Health Act. And within that, the federal government did levy penalties onto the provinces for scope creep into private care for certain aspects of healthcare delivery. And so that is already a tool that exists under the Canada Health Act to kind of keep that aspect in check. And then when you look at the approach that the federal government has taken to the Canada Health Transfer renegotiations now, by forcing the provinces to actually step up, and now they'll be expected to table action plans for exactly how they're going to use the increased Canada Health Transfer, and also the money that was set aside for bilateral negotiations on very specific identified shared priorities between the federal and provincial governments there. Because of the fact that they're going to have to table those, that will increase the accountability measures there. And that's something that the federal government is taking real pains to include into the process.
But I don't think it'll matter at the end of the day whether or not governments follow through with the condition from a political perspective, because the argument or the assertion that these actions have led to, let's say, hypothetically more privatization, it just resonates so easily with people. It's a values-based conversation, a values-based argument. Canadians think public healthcare is a value that we all share as a nation. To illustrate how effective it is, let me give you this example. During the last federal election, Justin Trudeau was attacking Conservatives for a secret plan to privatize healthcare while simultaneously arguing that and championing COVID-19 vaccinations, which were largely rolled out by the private sector through private clinics. So that just shows you the level of unfortunate ignorance that people have and how effective these attacks can be on a government.
That's a great segue to where I want to go. You raised, Jake, the last election. And speaking of the last election, we're all hearing, it's been top of news with regards to conversations about alleged interference by China in the last election, and calls for the Prime Minister to call a full inquiry about possible foreign interference. I'm wondering, John, the federal government is so far not going down that path. I'm wondering why they're not pursuing this. And in fact, Trudeau seems to be dismissive about these calls of alleged interference.
Well, when I look at this, I could see there being a couple reasonable political reasons internally for the Prime Minister and his team to actually be, let's say, maybe at least putting off a decision on a potential inquiry for the time being. First and foremost, the Chinese diaspora in Canadian politics is an incredibly important voting bloc. When you look at the GTA, when you look at Lower Mainland BC, when you look at certain urban ridings around Calgary, for example, there's a lot of communities there that, the Conservatives have won majority governments on in the past, and that the Liberal government more recently has won majority and then continued minority governments on since then. And so if those communities are going to be extremely important to you in the next election and are large enough that they could, reasonably speaking, sway, let's say a dozen, maybe a couple dozen ridings one way or the other, if the prime minister weren't to come out as an ardent defender of the community as a whole, that may lead to the demise of a certain number of seats that may flip immediately from liberal to conservative, and that could be enough to sway the results of the next election in the favor of the conservatives right then and there. But maybe we'll play a little bit of a game of hindsight is 2020 right now as well, in terms of if the prime minister comes out day one and says, yes, we're going to launch an inquiry, he's automatically taking on all of the damage all at once without having any wiggle room at that point, right? Because he's effectively throwing up the white towel, saying, yes, this may be a real issue and we need to look into it. Not that that would be necessarily wrong in terms of taking the security aspects of this very seriously. And obviously it's in the Liberal government's interest to take the idea of foreign interference in our elections very seriously. But with respect to the specific case around Handong, for example, if you are allowing a couple days to play out to be the defender of, let's say, the community more broadly.
Can I just interrupt? You're speaking of the MP from Toronto who Global
Yes.
has named as being one that won his riding because of Chinese interference. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And so if the prime minister is simply allowing here a couple days to play out, see where the news cycle goes, see if it tames down, see where the public opinion goes on this as well, he can always come back and call an inquiry anytime he wants to. And if it comes to that, he will not have taken any more damage than he would by having agreed to an inquiry in the first place on day one, because that will be a months-long, if not years-long process that will culminate in the final report. So that's going to be an extended process that inflicts a fair amount of damage. So he can always come back to that. And I don't think in this case that delaying any type of decision and being a defender of the community that could win him some brownie points, let's say maybe in the next election, as the defender of the minority groups, let's say in this case, the Chinese diaspora in Canada and certain urban ridings that are very important to the Liberal hopes in the next election. I don't think that's inflicting any more damage by waiting a couple days.
Jake, I have a feeling that you may have a slightly different perspective on this.
Yeah, a few. It's going to take me a long time to unpack it. So I was getting ready to laugh at John because I thought he was doing his best to defend what is a highly indefensible position of the prime minister. But I think John actually raised a really good point. And before I get to that point, I will say this. If we can literally have a legislator sitting in the House of Commons who got there through the influence of a foreign government, we're not a serious country anymore. Unions, yesterday, a number of journalists were laid off, unfortunately, in Ottawa, and their union came out and said that democracy is dead with that decision. A laughable notion, given the circumstances that we're discussing right now, with a sitting member of parliament potentially being in that place because of foreign interference. If we can't address that, we're not a serious country. That's why there's so much backlash against the prime minister. John mentioned something I think that is right in terms of the calculation of the PMO, and that's the Chinese diaspora. As someone who has worked on federal campaigns, it's incredibly difficult and very strategically important when criticizing China that you're not criticizing the China itself, that you're criticizing the PRC, the Communist Party of China. Those two lines blur very quickly. And the Mandarin speaking community, which makes up the bulk of the Chinese community here in Canada, doesn't like that. There's swift backlash to that. And even more so, at times I've noticed there's backlash to criticizing the PRC. And I asked my head of ethnic outreach one time why that was, and he just looked at me and smiled. He said, Jake, he says, dissidents don't escape China. People don't come to Canada from China who don't like China because they're allowed to leave. They don't escape. And that's why there's so much difficulty from a political perspective on communicating the Chinese community here in Canada, because at the end of the day, these are even those who have been here for generations, they've grown up in family homes and with people who admire China and don't despise it as we do in the West, perhaps with our ideals. So that's why that's one, it's a wrong call, because at the end of the day, that's the easy thing to do. It's not the right thing to do. But I agree with John, that might be one of the calculations. That's point one. Point two, From what I've seen, I was in the war room in 21. We were very aware that this was happening. The extent to which it was happening and the level of sophistication that's been noted in reporting, I would say we were largely unaware. It didn't alter what we did. We had a very robust attack plan on the Liberals and the Prime Minister on some issues involving China. We rolled those out effectively. And we were noting in real time the damage it seemed to be doing and the way it was being twisted in and around those communities that John mentioned. When we lost the election, we were immediately aware that things did not go as we planned in some of those ridings, and we set up internally at the OLO someone I don't want to pretend like it was very sophisticated, but a mechanism whereby we could better monitor the reaction of the community. Some of the things we were doing politically. I don't know if that's still in place. I highly doubt it because we left shortly thereafter. The last thing I'll say is that why not a public inquiry? I think everything in politics is 300% less complicated than one thinks. The Prime Minister probably wasn't shown or given advice to get rid of Hendong. I think that's largely been debunked by some people who are experts in how CSIS operates and what their mandate is with the Prime Minister's office and the Government of Canada. So that's probably not why he's worried about calling a public inquiry in terms of it exposing some direct or indirect affiliation with the Liberal Party of Canada. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think what he's worried about is having a larger conversation about the closeness the Liberal Party of Canada and he himself has with China. Mm-hmm. It's already a matter of public record that his family has a number of book deals with China that he and his brothers benefit from through the trust and then the inheritance they got from Pierre Elliott Trudeau. It's already a matter of public record that he and his brother engaged in negotiations and conversations about re-releasing those books with the Chinese entities. It's also a matter of public record that he himself has allowed his book, his autobiography, to be published by a Chinese company, and which has a philanthropic benefit to the Prime Minister, since he doesn't actually collect revenue from his autobiography. And it's also, it's also probably true that they don't really want to go there. They don't want an inquiry that's going to expose all of these uncomfortable questions. And even just the people that are around the Liberal Party of Canada, it's hard to believe that, there'd be many people within the party itself who are, intelligence assets. As someone who's been called an intelligence asset by Ezra Levant, I find it hard to believe or call somebody else that. And for those listening, it's because I worked for a Chinese company one time, so I was called a Chinese intelligence asset. I don't think that's the case, but I think what an inquiry might start as a conversation around the people who may surround some Liberals and who may have more nefarious motives for the advice and the influence they're trying to give. So it's a very long-winded question, but I don't think the Prime Minister is worried about his party being labeled some intelligence asset. I think John's right about the concerns around the Chinese diaspora in Canada, and I think anyone doubting that this was happening can take it from me that indeed it was noted in 21, and it was pretty apparent to even folks like me who weren't dealing with it on a day-to-day basis with the Government of Canada.
We'll certainly be watching then next week when MPs return to see where this goes. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to my colleagues John DeGaulle and Jake Enright. I'm Janet Silver. Till next time.